In the land of Azura, where the sun dipped into the horizon and painted the sky with hues of crimson and gold, there lived a wicked queen named Chidera. She ruled with an iron fist, crushing any opposition and enslaving the people of Azura. Queen Chidera's husband, King Kofi, was a just and fair man, but he was weak and often gave in to his wife's demands. One day, while Chidera was away on a journey, King Kofi lay with one of the palace maids, a beautiful young woman named Amara. Unbeknownst to King Kofi, Amara was a descendant of the great priestesses of Azura, and she possessed the gift of prophecy. As soon as she conceived, she knew that the child she carried would be a great savior, one who would bring freedom and justice to the people of Azura. Amara gave birth to a baby boy, and she named him Dozy. But Queen Chidera, who had been searching for a way to maintain her power and control over Azura, had a prophecy of her own. She was told that a child born of the royal bloodline would one day overthrow her and bring an end to her reign. Fearing for her power, Queen Chidera declared that all male children from birth to 3 years old would be put to death. She believed that by killing the children, she would prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. The people of Azura were horrified by the queen's decree, and many of them wept and mourned for the innocent children who would be slaughtered. But Amara, determined to save her son, began to make plans to hide Dozy and keep him safe from the queen's wrath. Amara knew that she had to act quickly to save her son. She took a small basket and gently placed Dozy inside. She covered him with a soft cloth and whispered a prayer to the gods to protect him. As she looked around, she spotted a small river that flowed through the outskirts of the palace. She knew that the river would carry her son to safety. Before she let go of the basket, Amara took a small, delicate knife and made a tiny incision on Dozy's forehead. She rubbed a mixture of herbs and spices into the wound, creating a small scar that would signify Dozy's royal heritage. With a heavy heart, she placed the basket in the river and watched as it floated away. As the basket floated down the river, it eventually came to rest near a small village. An elderly woman named Ngozi, who lived in the village, spotted the basket and pulled it out of the water. As she opened the cloth, she was surprised to see a beautiful baby boy inside. Ngozi took Dozy in and raised him as her own. She named him Kalechi and taught him the ways of the village. As Kalechi grew up, Ngozi noticed that he was different from the other children. He was kind, wise, and strong, and he seemed to have a special connection to the gods. Ngozi knew that Kalechi was special, and she did her best to prepare him for the great destiny that lay ahead. She taught him how to farm, hunt, and fight, and she shared with him the stories and legends of their people. As Kalechi grew into a strong and handsome young man, Ngozi knew that it was time for him to learn the truth about his past. She called him to her side and began to tell him the story of his royal heritage. Kalechi's eyes widened as Ngozi finished telling him the story of his royal heritage. He felt a surge of emotions, shock, anger, and a deep sense of responsibility. "It's time for me to return," Kalechi said, his voice firm and resolute. "I must save my people and take what is rightfully mine." Ngozi nodded, tears in her eyes. "I knew this day would come," she said. "You are ready, Kalechi. Go, and may the gods be with you." Kalechi set off towards the palace, his heart heavy with anticipation. As he approached the village, he was pained to see his people suffering under the cruel rule of Queen Chidera. They were thin and weary, their eyes sunken with despair. Kalechi tried to talk to them, to rally them to fight back against their oppressors, but none of them wanted to listen. They were too afraid, too broken. One elderly man, however, approached Kalechi and whispered a warning in his ear. "Be careful, young man," he said. "Queen Chidera is evil, and she will stop at nothing to keep her power. She has a dark spirit that guides her, and it has given her great power." Kalechi wandered the village, feeling defeated and alone. He had tried to rally his people, but no one was willing to join him. As he walked, he thought about his mother, Amara. He knew that she was still alive, and he hoped that she might be able to help him. After asking around, Kalechi finally found his mother's hut on the outskirts of the village. He knocked on the door, and a warm voice called out, "Enter!" Kalechi pushed open the door and was enveloped in a warm hug by his mother. "I've been waiting for you, my son," she said, tears shining in her eyes. Kalechi explained his situation to his mother, and she listened intently. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "I have an idea," she said. "You must get close to Queen Chidera, gather information about her plans, and possibly seduce her." Kalechi's eyes widened in surprise. "Seduce her? But why?" His mother's expression turned serious. "Queen Chidera's powers are tied to her chastity. If she sleeps with anyone from the king's bloodline, she will lose her powers and become vulnerable. You, my son, are the only one who can do this." Kalechi's mind reeled as he considered his mother's words. He knew it wouldn't be an easy task, but he was willing to try anything to save his people and reclaim his rightful place as king. "I'll do it," he said finally, determination burning in his heart. His mother nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I knew I could count on you, my son. Now let's get to work. We need to come up with a plan to get you into the palace and close to Queen Chidera." Amara handed Kalechi a small, intricately carved charm. "This will shield you from Queen Chidera's notice," she explained. "It will mask your scent and your connection to the king, allowing you to move freely in the palace without arousing suspicion." Kalechi took the charm and tied it around his wrist, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. With newfound confidence, he set off towards the palace. He entered the palace by posing as a new servant and was quickly absorbed into the bustling household. Kalechi worked hard to blend in, learning the intricacies of palace life and avoiding any behavior that might draw attention to himself. As he worked, Kalechi caught glimpses of Queen Chidera, who seemed even more beautiful and intimidating up close. He knew that he had to tread carefully, to slowly win her trust and affection without arousing her suspicion. Kalechi began to make subtle overtures towards the queen, offering her small kindnesses and compliments that seemed innocent enough on the surface. But beneath his polite exterior, Kalechi was carefully manipulating the queen's emotions, using his charm and good looks to slowly win her over. At first, Queen Chidera seemed oblivious to Kalechi's efforts, too caught up in her own power and prestige to notice the young servant's admiration. But as the days turned into weeks, Kalechi began to sense a subtle shift in the queen's demeanor, a faint softening in her expression whenever he was near. It was a small crack in the queen's armor, but Kalechi knew that it was enough. He had planted the seeds of interest in the queen's mind, and now all he had to do was wait for them to bloom. Kalechi's plan was working. The queen had begun to notice him, and he could sense her interest growing with each passing day. He knew that it was time to make his move. One night, under the light of a full moon, Kalechi made his way to the queen's chambers. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and he was determined to see it through. He knocked softly on the door, and the queen's voice called out, "Enter!" Kalechi slipped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The queen was reclining on a couch, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and desire. Kalechi smiled, his eyes locked on the queen's. He began to speak, his words dripping with honey and seduction. "My queen, you are as beautiful as the stars in the night sky. Your skin is as smooth as silk, and your eyes shine like the brightest diamonds." The queen's eyes fluttered closed, and she let out a soft sigh. Kalechi knew that he had her right where he wanted her. He began to undress, his movements slow and deliberate. The queen's eyes snapped open, and she watched him with a mixture of fascination and desire. Kalechi slipped into bed beside the queen, his body pressed against hers. He whispered sweet nothings in her ear, his lips tracing the curve of her neck. The queen's resistance crumbled, and she surrendered to Kalechi's charms. They made love, their bodies entwined in a passionate embrace. The next morning, the queen woke up to find that all her powers were gone. She stumbled out of bed, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She rushed to her shrine, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she arrived, she found that it was in disarray. The artifacts were scattered, and the sacred objects were broken. The queen's eyes filled with tears as she realized that she had been tricked. Kalechi, the young servant, was not who he seemed to be. He was the son of the king, and he had come to reclaim his rightful place on the throne. The queen's powers were gone, and she was left vulnerable and weak. She knew that she had to act fast or risk losing everything she had worked for. Queen Chidera, realizing her powers were gone, tried to fight back. She summoned her guards, but they refused to obey her. Without her powers, she was powerless. The villagers, who had suffered under her cruel rule for so long, saw their chance. They rounded her up, their faces twisted with anger and hatred. "You have brought suffering and pain to our people for far too long," one of the villagers spat. "Now it's time for you to pay." The villagers bound Queen Chidera's hands and feet, and then they set her ablaze. She screamed and struggled, but it was too late. The flames consumed her, and she was reduced to nothing more than a pile of ashes. The villagers cheered, their faces filled with joy and relief. They had finally been freed from the queen's tyranny. Kelechi, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward. The villagers turned to him, their eyes filled with gratitude. "You are the son of our beloved king," one of the villagers said. "You have freed us from the queen's cruelty. We crown you our new king." The villagers cheered, and they placed a crown on Kelechi's head. He smiled, his eyes filled with tears of joy. "I promise to rule with kindness and justice," he said. "I will do everything in my power to make our kingdom prosperous and happy." The villagers cheered again, and they celebrated long into the night. Kelechi, the new king, smiled and waved, his heart filled with joy and gratitude.